I hope you enjoyed the clip from The Wire. So now we're going to dive right in and look at some other causes of social order. We're going to start with self-interest. This is a new motive that we're looking at. We've already looked at emotion and habit. So let's think a little bit about self-interest. Self-interest is an internal state or motive. Other internal states include emotion, habit, or values. We'll learn about values next week. So what is self-interest? Well, I created something of a photo essay for us to look at. When we think of self-interest, we think of what's in it for me. We think of I heart myself, and that's all that matters. When we think of self-interest, we think of the idea of taking care of ourself. Basically, what we're talking about is selfishness. An individual motivated by self-interest thinks about the costs and benefits to himself or herself before deciding on a course of action. Often we think individuals motivated by self-interest are selfish. I would say that this is one spot on a spectrum of self-interest. Selfishness is an aspect of self-interest, but it's a very limited view of self-interest. So what we need to do is put selfishness in context. We're sort of born selfish. Many of you have sort of brought this up in class. The idea that we think about what's good for us. When we're babies, when we're children, we want the cookie, we want our parents' attention, we want to ask questions. So we are sort of born with this sort of selfish state. But what we need to do is realize that it develops, and we actually develop a better way of being self-interested. So here's some of the ways that self-interest sort of matures. You become more logical as you get older. A lot of parents, they make an error with their children. They believe that their children can think logically. The ability to think logically develops cognitively. If you take a developmental psychology class, the ability to think logically develops over time with children. If you try to reason with a 3-year-old and offer them logical reasons of why, they should do this or not do that, they don't understand because they can't think in those ways. Their cognition has not developed. But eventually, humans develop logic. It's part of the maturation process. We develop the ability to think and reflect on things. One of the things I want to point out is that the two motives we have already discussed, emotion and habit, really are not driven by thought. And by thought, I mean contemplative thought, where you're really sitting down and thinking. If you're motivated by habit, you're not thinking at all. You're doing what you did yesterday because it worked. If you're being motivated by emotion, there might be slightly more thought, but we're talking about a very small window between internal state and behavior. I'm angry, I get mad, and I start pounding my fists. I'm jealous, and I start, fuming at the mouth and just getting real mad, and I start, saying things and yelling and screaming because I'm jealous. Most of our emotions, the space between internal state and behavior is very small. We go from internal state to behavior pretty quickly with emotion. Similarly with habit. So I really want to emphasize that with self-interest, you are thinking in terms of logic, and you're engaging in contemplative thought when this is what's motivating you. You're thinking of how things weigh. You're weighing the different variables for decisions. Maybe you're developing a list of pros and cons. It's a very logical thing to do when you're thinking in terms of self-interest. So there's a lot of positive aspects of self-interest that I really want you to think about. And we talked about selfishness, which is about costs and benefits to me, and that's sort of how we're brought into this world is, I want the cookie, give me the damn cookie. But there's a way that self-interest sort of develops and matures as you get older. And eventually, you should start thinking in terms of enlightened self-interest. An individual motivated by enlightened self-interest thinks about the costs and benefits to himself or herself. That sounds like selfishness. And, capital letters, others. You're thinking about the costs and benefits to yourself and others before deciding on a course of action. I can't emphasize enough the importance of adding two words, and others. This is enlightened self-interest. When you realize that being selfish and just thinking about yourself, me, all that's important is me. As long as I take care of myself, that's all that matters. And others. You're now working under enlightened self-interest. The other important aspect here, the difference between selfishness and enlightened self-interest, is that people thinking in terms of enlightened self-interest think long-term and short-term. A lot of selfish behavior only considers yourself, and it's rather short-term. An enlightened self-interest person says, I care about myself, I care about the people around me, and I need to think long-term. So, if we think about selfishness as the man in a rowboat all by himself, sure, you want to be selfish, you're in a rowboat all by yourself. But if we think about a group of people in a boat, let's imagine for a moment that we're in a big boat and it starts to capsize, so we jump into the life rafts. And 15 of us jump into a life raft. The life raft is only able to hold 10 people. It's carrying 2 people more than it should have. It only has enough food for about 2 days for 10 people, and you've got 12. What do you do? Well, the selfish person might want to start throwing people overboard. Might want to start, trying to grab all the food and say, it's mine, it's my food, it's my food. But somebody working under enlightened self-interest would realize we're all in the same boat. If I try to start hoarding the food, if I start trying to throw people off, maybe I'll capsize the boat. And suddenly I'll go from being in a boat to not being in a boat. We'll go from having food to having no food at all. And that's the idea, is that when you're working under enlightened self-interest, you realize that your behaviors and your actions will impact others, and other people's behaviors and actions will impact you. So what do? You try to find options that work for you and for other people. That's enlightened self-interest. The idea is that we are all in this together. The idea is that whatever social situation we're in, we all have a piece of the puzzle, and when we all work together, we can put the puzzle together. The idea is that we think long-term rather than short-term. There's a lot of things going on in the U.S. political system, and a lot of it is a function of people thinking short-term rather than long-term. We can't just think about tomorrow. We need to think about the tomorrow of our children and our grandchildren. Enlightened self-interest. This is a very, very important factor for social order. A lot of this whole theoretical system that I'm trying to create rests on enlightened self-interest. The people that developed it, the rational choice theorists that developed this whole way of seeing the world, they claim that enlightened self-interest is our way to the promised land. I find it rather interesting. When I do this in class, I tell my students to realize that economists are basically saying this is the internal state that's going to bring us to Shangri-La as a society. If we all learn how to think about ourselves and think about others and think long-term, our society is going to be okay. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the humanities. And the humanities tend to be the defenders of human emotion. These are the people who read poetry and write rock and roll songs and heavy metal songs and love songs, emotional songs, and they paint pictures. They're the defenders of emotion. And what it means to be human to them is emotion. To the economists, they say it's enlightened self-interest. I find this to be a very fascinating debate in our society. It sort of touches on a lot of issues. In our society, a lot of people see women as emotional and men as logical and rational. Therefore, this debate between the humanities and the economists sort of translates into a larger societal debate about, differences between men and women. Another aspect that I find important about this is that a lot of corporations today want customer service to be about, giving a smile. And it's about sort of bringing emotion into corporate America. So you've got these corporations that are working under enlightened self-interest saying to their employees, we want you to be happy, because they're sort of commodifying our emotions. And then you've got advertisers who are using emotions to lure us into buying goods. So this is another sort of fascinating aspect of the debate where, there's enlightened self-interest and it's sort of juxtaposed with emotion, and yet the people who are saying enlightened self-interest is the road to, societal salvation are also the same people who are using emotion either for customer service or to bring us to advertise. A lot of our advertising is about pleasure, it's about love, it's about happiness, and they're using those emotions to get us to buy things. So I really like to think about these issues, and I hope you do too. One of the most important final thoughts I want to leave you with is that depending on the social conditions, the pursuit of self-interest can create cooperation and coordination. So this is probably one of the most important things I'm going to say in today's lecture. Social scientists, it is important for us to identify the social conditions that create enlightened self-interest, thereby producing social order. Again, a lot of my students believe that internal states, self-interest, jealousy, anger, happiness, habits, a lot of my students want to start there. But sociologists are saying all of those internal states, all those psychological states that you study in your psychology classes, they begin with social context. Why are you angry? It's not because you're an angry person. It's because there are social conditions producing your anger. Probably unmet needs. You need something, you can't get it, so you're angry. Well, all of those psychological states, all of the ways we feel, are caused by social conditions. So what do sociologists do? We study the social contexts that create those internal states to figure out, how to control those internal states. You want to have a happy family? Change the way your family functions and people will be happy. You want to have an efficient workplace where people get the job done? Change the social context. You're going to make people, more hardworking or whatever. So the idea is, how can we manipulate meaning and authority to create a person motivated by self-interest? What we're going to talk about in a moment is games and goods. So you have to ask the question, how do games and goods motivate enlightened self-interest? Again, most important thing I'm going to say today. Social conditions shape internal states. Therefore, sociologists study social conditions in order to figure out how to change internal states and create the internal states that we want.